This is Capitalize Your Finances, the show representing you, a select group of excited, ready, and fired up listeners seeking to potentially maximize your money moves and get after it. We don't settle for generic advice of always and nevers. Our currency is our intellect, and we constantly seek the logical way of likely creating advantages to potentially maximize wealth for our personal and unique situations. This show brings you the step-by-step framework to capitalize your finances in the aspects of your financial situation, and we strive to explore strategies and ideas to potentially help you capitalize on your financial decisions. We are capitalizers, and this is our show.
Welcome back to Capitalize Your Finances. As always, I'm your host, Christopher A. Panayiotou, the Cap in Capitalize. And today, we have a very special and rather unique guest that doesn't really need a gargantuan introduction. He is the founding drummer of Maroon 5. He is the author of one of my favorite books, Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all and finding recovery, as well as an award-winning licensed therapist down in Aruga, California. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Chris.
And also, for those of you listening in, we had a plethora of technical difficulties getting this guy on. And so the fact that he did come back on after our cameras literally died, it means the absolute world. Now, normally, Ryan, I would have you kind of give a little bit more background in depth of who you are, but I don't really think you need that. Okay, you're a pretty popular guy. You're in very high demand. And on a serious note, I did want to tell you, when your book was recommended to me by book thinkers, it was right around a time where I was getting really burnt out with just reading black and white, boring financial literature. And I thought, oh, this would be a great change of pace. And not only did I think it was a phenomenal book, I do mean it. It was one of the best books I've read, not only in a long time, but ever. And then secondarily, we're going to dive into it today. There was a lot of amazing business advice, whether you meant to give it or not. So I just wanted to first start off by saying thank you for all of that.
Wow. Well, thank you, man. that was very flattering. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. And so with that, let's just dive on in. So I'm not going to go through every single chapter, but the first couple chapters really hit home for me. So in chapter 4 of your book, you mentioned that you were very meticulous and almost an overthinking type of guy. And this was unlike a little well-known star, Adam Levine, who was all over the place. And specifically, you were also saying you almost had an obsessive compulsive mentality. So financially speaking, how has that been both a positive and a negative for you? And what was it like managing the financial side of things, both when you were drumming as well as the band as a whole, if you did so?
Well, I guess as an obsessive compulsive person, a perfectionist, a control freak, whatever you want to call it, my tendency, I think, in terms financially is to be pretty conservative. Risk historically would terrify me. And as you can imagine, Adam, in terms of his personality and us being polar opposites in some way, he was the guy that, the moment we got our first publishing check, he wanted to go throw it on the blackjack table in Vegas,
Yes.
So we were pretty different in that regard. I think we've both done all right in terms of planning for the future and all that stuff. Obviously, he's done a little better than I have, but
Yeah. Well, we're not getting into comparing.
No,
We're not getting into comparing. And you did mention being conservative with your money. I was going to bring this up later. In the book, you did mention that, and I think what you said directly was when you got your first royalty checks, you were thinking, how many of these do I need before I can afford a mortgage? Which it made me smile pretty hard.
Yeah, well, early on, I think a lot of people assume when you have a record deal and or you're starting to have a little bit of success that you're making a lot of money. And I knew guys that were in bands that had gold records and stuff, and they were basically living tour to tour. So, I mean, we didn't really have substantial income from music until we were like a platinum artist headlining. I think our first headlining tour in the fall of 2003 was the first time that I saw a significant check. We had a publishing deal at that point too. So that was almost a decade into our career, believe it or not. I mean, it was 9 years into our career. And at that point, yeah, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot until more money came in terms of planning for the future investment, really. But we were fortunate enough to have a great family friend, Richard Feldstein, who was our business manager and giving us great advice in terms of how to plan for the future. But yes, I take after my dad. You know, I don't like spending money. I like planning for the future. I wanted to put as much as I could into a mortgage or other kind of long-term investments. And that was kind of my game plan from the first day we started making any money.
Oh yeah, and we're gonna dive so much into that today. And speaking of the business side, and that's kind of where the first couple questions I had lined up for you align on. You actually mentioned in chapter 5, I believe, because you took on the role of, what was it, manager or agent, so to speak, before you guys hit it big, and you were doing everything from selling tickets to organizing guest lists, negotiations. So what was that process like? And take us through what it was like just a little bit, because we have a number of capitalizers who actually want to get into the music business, but they would have no idea how this process works.
Well, for us, you know, we were a high school band in the 90s in Hollywood. And, you know, it was actually fortunate for us that there was something called pay to play in those days, you know, which basically meant you could walk into the Whiskey A Go-Go or the Roxy Theater or the Doug Weston's Troubadour, which were these storied institutions since the 60s and 70s of the heyday of classic rock. But you could just walk in there, you know, with a demo tape and basically get a contract to perform if you were willing to pay cash up front for the tickets and then sell them yourself. So that was a pretty easy negotiation. It was just how many tickets they were willing to do it for. So you might have to buy 50 tickets. You might have to buy 100 tickets. And then you could sell them for whatever you wanted. It was just a matter of whether it was realistic to sell them and how much profit you were trying to make, if any. For us, it wasn't about profit at that point. It was really about trying to get people to come to our shows and build a following so that, you know, the long-term goal obviously was to get a buzz around town so that we could get a record deal. So we were thinking much less about how are we going to make some cash and more about how are we going to build a future for this band. So I guess I was pretty entrepreneurial at that point. It's weird. I never really thought of myself as an entrepreneur until relatively recently with my book and the other things I'm doing now. But back then, you know, as teenagers, we were kind of hustling. I know that I was the oldest guy in the band too, so I was the one with a car, a hand-me-down Jeep Wagoneer, and so I was the one that was like driving around town and selling tickets to our buddies and to family members and stuff. But once, you know, we got involved with some record labels and stuff, then it was a whole other ballgame, and we had attorneys and agents and all those people involved.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, that sounds like both a lot of fun and then not nearly as much fun as people would imagine. Well, and you, speaking of like the big deal, you guys mentioned when you first got your first record deal in the experience, you used the term, quote, you got stars in your eyes.
Yeah.
And knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently during that experience? And what advice would you give aspiring artists once they hit that big moment and they get the stars in their eyes?
Mm-hmm. Well, we kind of assumed, probably like most people do, that, you know, if you're talented enough that you know, major companies take notice of you and want to sign you to a record deal, that means you're going to be a big star. You know, all you have to do is make the album, put it out, and then go on the road, and you're going to be, for us, we're going to be the next Pearl Jam, or, you know, it was the 90s. So,
yeah, that's okay.
But, you know, I think that we learned a lot from the failure of that record. We learned a lot of things that we took for granted, you know, some of the naivete that we had going into the industry at that point. It was the old model. In those days, a record label would sign 10 acts a year. They'd spend $1 million on each of them, and 9 of them would fail, but the one that succeeded would make all their money back and more, and then they would just drop the other 9. So you basically ended up being a casualty of this sink or swim model, is what they called it, I guess.
Sure.
And we were one of the ones that sank. I mean, our album came out. We had 1 week that the single went to radio and did relatively well for a week, and then fell off the radar. We toured for about 6 months, and then we came home with our tails between our legs. And it took us 5 years after that to rebuild and figure out how to establish ourselves again from, square one and become Maroon 5. We changed our name in that time as well.
Yeah, because it was in the listeners, right, that have not read the book. Which, if you have not bought the book, what are you doing? Don't be an idiot. Go online and buy the book right now. But I digress. It was Kara's Flowers.
Right.
Kara's Flowers. Yeah, it's because most people call it Kara, which is wrong. And I looked at it. I went to school with the Kara, so I felt pretty hyped that I got it right the first time.
Well, that was part of the reason why we changed the names, because everyone mispronounced it and it was annoying us. But it was also because of branding. We had a record deal as Kara's Flowers, which had failed. And so everyone in the industry just knew us as this band that had already failed. And they connected us to the sound of that record, which was this sort of mid-90s power pop Weezer-ish kind of sound. And so our style had changed, and we were developing what would ultimately become Maroon 5, and we realized we needed to have a new name that differentiated ourselves from that history. But the thing that we learned, the second time through, we were looking for the opposite of the first experience, because when I said, stars in our eyes, it's like, oh, this guy produced Green Day. This record label put out, the Goo Goo Dolls, or whoever else was on the charts at that time, and this manager and this agent, the big time guys, thinking you can't fail if you have those big names behind you. But what was more important to us the second time around was the hustle, right? It was the guys that had as much to prove as we did. And we hired our childhood friend, Jordan Feldstein. I mentioned Richard earlier as his son. Jordy was an old friend of ours. I had played soccer with him as a kid. He was my age, and he was 22, 23, and a junior agent and wanting to make a name for himself. And he was like, look, I'm going to go out there and fight for you. I'm going to walk into every record label in LA and New York and otherwise, and I'm going to get you a record deal. I'm going to do everything I can to make you guys the biggest band on the planet. And so we saw the fire in him, which we didn't see really in the people the big time guys that represented us before. And the label that came to us that eventually, after every other major label passed on us, was this upstart independent label called Octone Records, who had distribution through a major label. So it was kind of a best of both worlds combination there. And they said the same thing. They said, we want to do this grassroots. We want you on the road for at least a year before we really put out the single. We want to build a following organically, the old-fashioned way. And that was like music to our ears, because we had gone through the sink or swim. We had put out a single with a lot of promotion and money behind it, and it flopped. So we wanted a situation where we had more control over the outcome and more sort of sweat equity from these guys than actual dollars. And it's kind of ironic, because the album Songs About Jane, which became our big breakthrough album and sold more than I think any record they've made since, was for like a quarter of the budget of the one that we did for Warner Brothers. And that one sold like 3,000 copies or something like that. So
really interesting. Well, as I was reading and just thinking about this too, your book is like a movie almost. Really, like, because I caught myself reading and then zoning out. This gives you an idea of like how locked in I was. I brought your book to the hospital. I wasn't reading it obviously as my wife was giving birth to our daughter, but like while she was in labor, because we were there for a couple days, kind of in between, it's like, all right, well, the nurses are there. I don't really have anything else to contribute to. And so I was reading it, and then I'm zoning out thinking like, whoa, you had so many to-dos in your book, or excuse me, in your book, but in your band life, that you were almost like a chief operating officer of your band. And so one of the questions I had for you was, later in life, did you ever think about like going into the like management of bands business, almost like a consultant, or was that just like too much? And so because of where you're at today with your therapy, your licensed therapy practice, it's much more of what I call the concentrated portfolio type of lifestyle. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, first off, congratulations on the baby.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a
Wonderful.
month and I am very tired.
I'm sure. You don't seem like it.
Yeah, well, yeah, I hide it well. I hide it
Okay.
well, but thank you.
Yeah. Well, I did try actually. After leaving the band, I kind of segued pretty quickly. My mindset was I'm going to be a record producer and maybe a band manager.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be behind the scenes. I always enjoyed the creative process. I think more than the touring and performing aspect. Um, so I was looking to do that, and I got some gigs, and I did some independent work and stuff, and I did some songwriting, and I thought that would be my next career. There were a lot of reasons why it didn't become really a career. As much as it was fun, I think that for me, everything I was doing, I was comparing to my previous career, and
yeah,
that was a tough thing to do because it had been. I didn't even realize. I knew it was special when I was in it, but I didn't realize how special. Nobody tells you it's the good old days while you're living them,
right.
right? But I didn't realize just not even just the success, which came later, but just the process. Being in the collaborative process with those three and then four other guys was so fulfilling and so special. I mean, it was like a spiritual connection between us, really. That there was not really anything that could match up to that. And working with new people on their music was fun and it was fulfilling to a certain degree, but it was hard, watching my old band still out there having a ton more success than I was,
Yeah,
to compare. And then just the realities of the business. I'm kind of a dinosaur now. I come from the era when you record on analog tape. That
yeah,
was my era, and you made
yeah,
a rock record from the ground up. Now guys are making pop records in their bedroom with a laptop, and it's a very different kind of thing. So building an artist with today's media and everything that goes into it, it's a different world than when I built the band
sure.
from the ground up. So in some ways, I feel like the industry kind of passed me by, and I was just kind of trying to catch up. But then also because in 2016, I quit drinking. I started this whole new journey of recovery from the mental health struggles I was having, anxiety, and everything else. And I kind of closed that chapter of my life and started a new one, which has just been so fulfilling in new and interesting ways, that I couldn't have foreseen. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I've been a bit entrepreneurial, writing a book and putting it out, and now beginning to do speaking engagements and stuff like that. So it's a different path, but strangely enough, the music world has found its way back to me, or I've found my way
Sure.
back to it, not as a performer or producer, but as somebody who talks about mental health for artists. I'm doing a lot of different appearances, panels, and things at conventions and festivals and things. So it's all integrated for me. It's all part of, I don't know what the term you used in terms of portfolio, but it's all integrated for me, and it's all stuff that I enjoy and that I find to be a part of what I do.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and as far as like terminology and like portfolios and finance, don't worry about any of that because a lot of it is absolute garbage. So, but I totally get what you're saying, and it is cool, and that actually spurs off of, and you had a ton of quotes in your book that I loved and admired. The one that hit me the hardest was quote, "Sometimes you have to go too far before you can find just right." And so you already answered it a little bit, and I'm not going to give too much of what you meant in the book away. But my question to you is, what are some of the places in your life where you have went too far, positively speaking, and found just right for you, being that entertainingly, personally, financially, you name it?
Well, I think that was a process. I'm referring to obviously as artists, as performers. We had to find the balance because for a lot of performers, you have that hesitation at first, maybe the nervous anxiety about performing that doesn't allow you to go far enough. I think we didn't really think of ourselves coming of age when we did in the early 90s. We didn't think of ourselves as performers per se in the old fashioned sense of like, a top hat and a cane and a song and a dance,
Yes.
we were rock and roll guys. We were a garage band. And we were emulating Nirvana and that kind of aesthetic, which was much more shoegazing and less, less of a ham. So I think that in some ways we weren't really interested in going over the top in terms of performance. But then we realized at a certain point that, you have to put on a show, and you have to push yourself to grab your audience, whether it be on record or on stage, or just in terms of how you're promoting yourself and how your image and your branding is being thought of. And I was not somebody who was that interested in image. The other guys were a little more interested in that than I was. But I realized at a certain point that it matters. If you're going out there and you have something to say as an artist, it's all part of the package. So anyway, basically what that meant was, for Adam in particular, what is going out on stage and giving a good performance. And I think we had to experiment with going too far, going over the top and being almost, grandiose or bombastic or overtly sexual at times, before we scaled it back and found, what felt like the sweet spot for us in terms of a natural, organic, authentic self in the music that we were making and in the performance that we were doing. And I think for me, I'm negotiating that in my life now. Again, I think because I spent a decade after I left the band kind of hiding away and isolating myself and feeling really defeated and not wanting to put myself out there really in a lot of ways. And now that I realize that I have a little bit of a platform again, and not because I'm seeking fame and glory, but because I have something to say, I'm finding that, I have to negotiate that again in terms of how much do I put myself out there, what feels comfortable in terms of representing myself in a public way, and in terms of what my platform is exactly and how to sort of work into that. So it's an interesting thing. I think you do have to sometimes try things out and push yourself a little bit past your comfort zone. And then you'll know when you've gone too far,
Oh, yes.
And then you scale it back a little bit.
Oh, yeah. No, I can tell you, I can tell you. So, I know we just met today and we've been pinging back and forth, and now we're Instagram besties. So, now we're basically best friends, but you've probably figured out that I like to bring humor into the world, and going too far, there was a soon to be guest that we're having on soon, and he, without giving away names, he went to a very prestigious university. And so I told him that I went to the Oxford of the United States. He said, "Oh, Harvard." I'm like, "Oh no, he's just not, this joke isn't going to land, right?" But then you just kind of keep going. It's like, "Oh, for sure, Stanford." And I said, "No, Oregon." Right? So it wasn't that hard to get into University of Oregon. Like, it just is what it is. And it went so far over his head. And I'm going, oh boy. Like, he's still coming on the show. It's going to be fantastic. But it is one of those things where it is a balancing act as far as, like, do you go too far into humor? Or sometimes you got to sway it back. For you guys on stage, again, I won't give it away, but yeah, there were times where I'm sure you were like, oh my gosh, like, I think we air humped one too many times. One thing that was fascinating, learning more about you, Ryan, and getting to know you is you are a little bit more introverted. And I think for those that are listening that do want to get into performing and frankly, they're just terrified, Ryan is a perfect example of you do not have to be an obnoxious extrovert like me. I mean, you can get on stage, right? And even though, drummers, I've learned are a little bit more introverted, right? Just like the nature of it. Nonetheless, like, you are still an amazing performer and still are. So I think that's a phenomenal takeaway. Now, fun little question, totally not financial related at all. Who is your favorite or R&B artist or artists of all time? I've been dying to ask you this.
Of all time.
Of all time.
The first one that leaps to mind is Marvin Gaye. I think he had just the silkiest voice and the most emotive, just the way that he sang and as a songwriter too. You just can't beat that. But there's so many. No. I mean, Al Green was formative for us as well. Who else? Well, certainly, I mean, crossing over into pop, you got Michael Jackson and Prince. I don't know if you'd say that was R&B.
Sure.
Sure. There were contemporaries also for us when we were writing songs about Jane. I'm trying to remember who, because it was a lot more hip hop, I think, like Missy Elliott and stuff like that. That was really influential to our sound at that time.
Yeah.
I try to stay up. There's a lot of cool. I mean, I love SZA today. She's cool.
She's great. Well, I was gonna say because like my all time favorite is Stevie Wonder,
Stevie
and
Wonder. Well,
then
yeah,
I mean you can't. I mean he's the goat. You know.
yeah.
Um,
I almost
and
can't even
also
like put Stevie Wonder into a category. It's like he transcends any genre. I mean, you could call him R&B, you could call him pop, but it's like it's jazz as much as it is anything else because his
yeah
compositions are so musical. I
yeah
almost like if you said one genre, I wouldn't even think of unless you said all genres.
yeah. Well, because he's one of those guys that, and I feel like in a lot of industry, well, yeah, I'm gonna say this in a lot of industries, there's that one person or people, but generally one person where they are the everything. Like they've become their own entity and brand. Like Stevie Wonder, like you said, he's not really jazz, he's not R&B, he's not pop. He is, but he's really just Stevie Wonder because
Hmm.
if you pigeonhole him, it doesn't really do justice. Now, I have to also ask because you were a product of the 90s, okay? So specifically 90s R&B artists or artists. Who is your favorite?
That's tougher. Yeah, I'm trying to think about who I was plugged into in the '90s. I wasn't listening to a lot of R&B until the late '90s, and to be honest, at a certain point, R. Kelly was definitely somebody I was listening
Yes.
to. Can't say that now.
Yeah, no, you cannot. No, you cannot. No. But like the guy put out banger after banger for years.
That's truth.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the right play on words, but
Yeah, yeah.
but he
I
did.
didn't say it.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I totally did. Well, and the reason why I was asking, and I wanted to get your take on this, because some of my friends, so I'm huge. I love R&B and I loved hip hop and rap. A not so fun fact about me: in high school, I actually put out 2 rap songs on iTunes. They were taken down, thank God.
Oh wow.
Just because like my best friend even played it at my wedding as just like making fun of, and I still have nightmares about it. But as far as my friends criticizing me on the 90s R&B's artists, my favorite group is actually Jagged Edge. And the reason
Oh
why
yeah, yeah.
they say that's controversial is because they'll say, well, that's a 2000s group. I go, no, they came around in like 90, I think it was like 93 or 94, but they didn't really pop until what, 2003, 4? Like when the Seasons Change came out, Walked Out of Heaven came out. And so I was like, oh, hopefully I'm not like totally off my game here. Like would you say they're a 90s group?
It's hard to remember, what years certain things came out, and I would say I remember one single of theirs in particular around maybe '99 or 2000.
Which one?
I forget the name of it.
Really stuck with you.
No, well, I mean, it's not like they were my favorite artist or anything like that. I'm trying to go with you here.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. No, that's okay. That's okay. No, it is tough. It's just kind of interesting. Like, I don't know if you have to deal with it. Well, you probably deal with it a lot more than I do, because obviously I'm not like a artist or any of that. But you know how like music snobs will be like, oh my gosh, like they are totally not a 90s group. Like they were, circa 2001 or circa 2000 or whatever the case is. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. I was more curious. But shifting back to professionally, so you went to UCLA, go Bruins. Fun little fact, you have our old football coach, Chip Kelly. You're welcome for that. Now, you took a job of filing paperwork at an accounting office, which is probably the definition of opposite in terms of fun scale that you had touring. But I wanted to ask you, what were some of the financial takeaways you learned from your short time there? And did any of those moments help you in building your financial success, both in the band as well as beyond and into today?
My financial takeaways were that Kenny Babyface Edmonds made a lot of money.
Yeah.
That was about
Okay. Okay. Okay.
No, I was there, I don't know, for a short period of time. It was right when I graduated from UCLA, before we went on the road. this is how frugal I was. We got, I think, like 30 grand when we got bought out of our contract. I mean, a piece when we got out of our contract with Warner Brothers. That was in 98, I think. And
Sure.
we didn't go on the road again until 2002. I somehow made 30 grand last like 3 or 4 years while I was at UCLA. Granted, my parents were paying the tuition part, but I was figuring out, somehow I stretched it out. I had some money in the bank and I made it work. But anyway,
Yeah.
so it was gone. I was like, am I just going to live off of credit cards for a little while until I go on the road? And I was realizing I had rent still. There was no way I couldn't get a job for whatever amount of months it was until we left. So I asked our accountants, our business managers. They were called Provident at the time. This was Richard Feldstein, our good friend Rich, and he's like, oh yeah, well, you'll be a runner or a filer. And basically what I did was I bounced from one office to the next each day and did all the stuff that they needed, all the stuff they had backed up, just filing and stuff like that, making copies or whatever.
Sure.
And so I was just, it was interesting. All these bands that I was fans of, I was seeing their receipts coming in and just seeing, look, I didn't learn much. It was just basically punching holes in Merrill Lynch statements and filing them away.
Got it. Okay.
I saw things I probably shouldn't have seen, but I can't share that here.
No. Like you meet with like, I don't know, a big pop artist or whatever. And you're like, yeah, I saw your social security number last year and I was filing your, okay. Yeah, no, I totally get it. And what was the guy's name? Kenny?
Well, Babyface. Remember Babyface? Talking about R&B.
Yeah. I mean, with a name like that, you can't not make a minimum of $5 million a year. Like,
oh, it was like, I mean, the checks that were going in and out on a daily basis. I didn't know that people spent that much money, like different houses all over the place and all. It's crazy.
Capitalizers, this episode is sponsored by the best-selling book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. Regardless of where you're at in your financial life, whether you're just beginning to express interest and commitment to your personal finances, at the pinnacle of your career, winding down into retirement, or thinking about your legacy for future generations, this book walks you through every step of the way so you can succeed on your terms and with your own values and passions guiding you. After reading this book, you will officially have Christopher A. Panayotou, the Cap in Capitalize, in your back pocket, guiding you in detail through every step of the way so that you can take charge of your finances, not the other way around. Head on over to Amazon.com today and start capitalizing your finances to the fullest with this incredible book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to financial framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. And now, back to the episode.
No, that's totally wild. Well, and you mentioned a little bit earlier how crazy the like once you hit it big, okay, the financial side of the music industry is. And it was interesting. Before we did this interview, I was trying to do some research on kind of like the understanding and framework of how financially the industry works, because no one really talks about it, which I thought's kind of odd. I'm not asking like for specific numbers, but as far as like touring, the initial advance, break even, just dip a toe into what that looks like. You mentioned it a little earlier, but just a little bit more, because then it gives people a better understanding whether they're getting into music. We actually have listeners that want to get into music agency, and it can give them a much more well-rounded understanding of the financial side of the business.
Sure. Well, as an artist, let me explain the reason why you won't make any money as an artist. Okay.
Nice.
Now, historically, obviously, record deals are exploitive of artists because all the money is on one side of that business transaction, right? You have this corporation that's going to invest all these funds in this artist, and basically the artist just has to agree whatever the terms are to get that privilege. So basically, they put all the money up front on making the record, making the video, doing the photo shoots and the artwork and the promotional stuff, doing the advertising and putting you on tour. So, going on tour is expensive. Every tour, there's a big overhead. Even if you're in a van, just renting that van, getting hotel rooms for you and the crew, the gas going to each town. And early on, you're not making a whole lot. You know, there's not a lot of income coming in. You might get $50 to $200 for an opening gig, maybe at a bar, you know, and depending on if anyone shows up. And so there's a lot of overhead. And, you know, I think that it's pretty realistic that a lot of times the record label has spent, well, in those days, you know, close to $1 million just to get your album out there and to make the video and all that stuff. So now your record deal, you're getting on average maybe 14, 15 points of profit, right, from what's coming in. But out of that, you have to recoup all of the overhead.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so which means that you have to sell at least 1 million records because of, I mean, just to make back their investment and then recoup, you know, out of your cut, that overhead before you start seeing profit. Now, that's not the only way to make money is on selling records. And of course, today it's not a way that people make money at all because nobody buys records anymore. Sure. So publishing and touring are the ways that artists make the most money. Of course, you know, like I said, touring is expensive. So if you're a band like Maroon 5 that sells 1 million tickets around the world when they do a world tour, it's very profitable. You know, they're making, I don't know, 8 or 9 figures, I'm sure. You know, I don't know exactly the numbers, but sure. But something, you know, that you would expect for a band of that caliber. The Rolling Stones, you know, I'm sure that when Mariah Carey or other artists like go out there, that's very profitable. But it's like the major leagues, you know, compared for baseball or for another sport. For every one person who reaches that level, there's another 1,000 who aren't making a dime. But there are artists that can do it. They can go out there and live kind of tour to tour and make enough of a grassroots following that they can play clubs and stuff and support their art. It's just not the kind of money that you would expect. But publishing can be lucrative if you're a songwriter or you are involved with that, owning your own songs, owning other people's songs. That's good investment if you know what you're doing too, because that's, you know, when you have a hit song, that could be very profitable. There's a lot of different avenues that publishing can come in, and there's different kinds of publishing. Of course, there's the performance rights, and there's there's 2 different aspects: the artist and the songwriter. And so it's a little complicated. I don't know all the ins and outs, and I certainly don't know exactly the industry today as it is compared to what it was 20 years ago. But I know that if you look at who's really making the money, other than the few very successful artists, it's probably the companies that are distributing those, and the ones who are promoting the tours, the Live Nations of the world, and those people. Sure. So, you know, if you're savvy enough to get involved on that level and invest in that kind of promotional company, or then that's a world I wouldn't know anything about. But there is a lot of money to be made. Obviously, it's just it's all at the top, though, it seems like, right?
Yeah. That's kind of how it works. Well, you know, I will say, just kind of a quick side note. I don't know why it made me laugh, but I was just thinking of you guys in this van, and it just, like, without even painting a picture, I'm like, okay, 4 or 5 guys at a time or whatever, broke as hell, driving around the country in this beat up van. And then you transition to this bus, which, like, the real bus is what you said versus the worn down one. The only thing I was going to say, because I was a huge gamer growing up, and when I was reading, I'm like, I kept reading. And then you were telling me that you weren't a huge gaming fan. Adam was the gaming fan, but then you were saying that I think Halo was really big at the time. And I personally wasn't a huge Halo fan. So, like, I was like, okay, I'm gonna Ryan saved a little bit of hope for me there. But you know, going back to, like, the theme sprinkled throughout the book, you kept mentioning the cost of the tour, bottom line profitability. You actually just went over it all right now. So I guess my question is, you have all of that knowledge. Like, have you ever thought about just starting a master class on all of this? Because you kind of just gave one right now.
I haven't. You know, I wouldn't consider myself somebody who's an expert on this stuff. There is a book called it's like Everything You Need to Know About the Music Business or something like that. A guy named Passman. His kid went to Brentwood with us. That's why I know this. Don Passman, I think. He wrote, like, the definitive book on the music business and everything you need to know if you're going into you know, as an artist or as an attorney negotiating contracts. I don't know. Again, this is 25 years ago, probably now 30 years ago that he wrote it. So it might need an update in terms of what the world of the music industry is now. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. My dad always has ideas like that for me. He's like, hey, you should teach a class on the Beatles at UCLA.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Oh,
you know
you'd
so
be
much about.
great. You would be great. And actually, too, one book, speaking of books that I remember reading, because again, I'm an extrovert, and when I started my business and the show, I wanted to know how introverts thought and operated. And there's an amazing book. You should check it out. It's called Ask by Dan Solon. And this guy is a business coach. He was an attorney, like very, very successful. But he's super introverted, like cannot stand, right? Like, I don't know, I want to say human interaction. Like that's a little stretch, but he really doesn't appreciate it. But that book like revolutionized how I thought about really everything. But the thing that I thought of with you is you're so easy to talk to, and every time you speak, you're not wasting time, right? It's very concise. And so if you ever started a master class, man, people would eat into that till kingdom come. So just chomp on that. Now, you know, it's interesting when Maroon 5 was just blowing up, like during that time in the, I'd say the 2000s, that was like euphoria in like a number of ways. Like, you know, every celebrity that you were talking about in the book, I grew up idolizing as a child. And the one group of people in particular that you kept mentioning was the hobbits in the Lord of the Ring cast. And so I have to ask, like, was that one of your favorite movies of the 2000s?
No.
Oh my God, no! No, because you mentioned it like they were just the best.
Well,
It's my favorite movie series. So
well, here's the thing. I think this probably comes down to the difference between brothers. My brother, it was like a sci-fi fantasy kid. He read all those books. He was a huge Lord of the Rings fan.
awesome.
And in a lot of ways, we're similar in a lot of ways, but I think I had to differentiate myself from him in certain ways.
Sure.
And he was kind of the geeky, like nerdy guy who really into science and math. And he plays the guitar too, and he's a creative guy, so it's not just that. But I kind of went the other route, and I was more the creative, literary guy, the more sensitive guy, and obviously the artist. And I don't know. I think our taste kind of branched out in certain ways in that way too. And when I came of age and got into adult things, the Star Wars and the Lord of the Rings and all that stuff from my childhood kind of fell away. So by the time those movies came out and I was in my 20s, I was kind of like, I don't know, I wasn't that into. But they were very nice guys. They came to our shows early on. Yeah, they were. I don't know if they had already made the first film or what, but like one of our shows at the Viper Room one night, like 4 of the Hobbits came in. And we're like,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I guess too, because, you know, I'm not trying to date you. I am a little bit younger. So when they came out, I think in like 1990, it was 99, 2000, 2001. Not that I remember numbers or anything, but I was like in 4th grade, right? So like looking at that, it was just magical. I'm not going to judge you on the fact that it's not one of your favorite movies. I get it. You were an adult with a natural life. I was a child with no life. So,
You're making me feel old now. Too.
yeah, no, well, you're not old. You're vintage and experienced. Okay.
Right.
Now for you, you know, not getting too touchy on the subject because, like, I know I can only imagine what you went through when you did separate from Maroon 5. But when you did, one thing that struck me was it's very similar to like when business owners go and sell their own business, and that's both financially and personally. What I mean by that is, you know, knowing what you know now, because like a lot of people think, oh my gosh, I don't want to sell, but it's the right thing to do, and it's a huge emotional burden. What would be your advice that you would give successful artists that did recently cash out? I mean, the one that I'm thinking of is Justin Bieber. I think what was it, like $200 million he just sold out to? What would be your advice once these artists start to turn the corner?
He sold his catalog, I guess. Is that what you're
Yeah,
referring to? Yeah.
200 million.
Yeah. Well, certainly 200 million in hand is better than,
Oh yeah,
I
yeah,
think I could live with that,
yeah.
certainly.
Right, right, right.
For me, it was obviously a different situation because I was having to walk away from what obviously would be a very lucrative future to be playing for another decade with Maroon 5. I was fortunate enough to have a father who's an attorney and looking out for my best interest. I was kind of like, I was so defeated. I was ready to just walk away and never, sort of go back to that world again. But he was like, wait a minute, like you're a founding member of this band, like you built this thing, you deserve some ownership. So I'm very glad that he was able to fight for that, and it was very helpful for me moving forward. But what was devastating more than the lost opportunity financially was, I mean, that pales in comparison to what I lost in terms of just my identity.
Sure.
So much of myself was wrapped up in not just the music and the image of the band, but these were my brothers. This was something that we built together from the ground up, from my parents' garage all the way to the biggest arenas in the world. And now I was having to walk away from that, and they were going to go on without me. And it was, my entire world kind of centered around the band. All of my friends, my social sphere was really centered on the band. And just I lost all of my self-confidence too, because I think I had really invested my self-worth in the work that we were doing. And when we finally had that success and it paid off after a decade of all that work, that was kind of like the validation of everything we had invested in it. And now that was gone. And I was the drummer of Maroon 5 who couldn't drum. So, it was heartbreaking, and it really knocked me down in terms of my self-esteem. And I just didn't even really know who I was anymore. And so I had to do a lot of soul searching and really I look back on it now as a grieving process. It was something that I had to go through all the stages of grief, mourning that loss and that life that once was and wouldn't be again, and finding a new way to find self-definition. And really, that came when I found new purpose and new meaning in my life that I was able to create in something that was ultimately and has been as if not more fulfilling than what I did with the band. I mean, that's not saying that it wasn't extremely fulfilling, sure, both in the creation of the band and the music we made, and in entertaining people. In getting the ability to bring that joy and that fun to people that come to see a show. But I'm helping people one-on-one, as a therapist, giving of my time, being of service to others in hopefully a way that has an impact that goes beyond, just entertaining people.
Sure.
And for me, there's just another element to that that strikes even more to my core in terms of what I hold valuable. So I'm in a different place in my life too. I'm in my 40s now, and I'm thinking about what it is that I'm putting out into the world as much as wanting to be validated. So
Sure.
it's definitely a different place, but it's been wonderful.
Yeah. No, and I can feel it too. Like it's one thing when people say all of that, but whether it's your writing or just having conversations with you, I can feel you're in arguably the best place you've ever been in your life, and actually turning that darkness of what you went through to the light. As you transition to normalcy, you kept referring to having the conversations with yourself and your family of how the band's moved on, but then also like the band moved on from itself in a way, from what got it to where it was. And again, earlier I mentioned business owners, sometimes they just beat themselves up about it because it wasn't how it was. It wasn't the good old days anymore, but you need to get there. And so I guess for you, regarding your therapy clients, is given your journey through all of that fame, stardom, crash burn, rebuilding, with your founders and CEOs, and whether it's in music or business, how have you used that experience to bring peace to your most successful clients?
Well, certainly everything that I've lived informs what I do in therapy with my clients. I think that going back and getting the education that I did at this point in my life was just icing on the cake in terms of, the life experience is what really, I think, gives me something unique, hopefully, to offer my clients because anything that they come in with, I've probably experienced it on some level, maybe not specifically their unique story, but I find so often that I can connect to my clients in a way that maybe somebody who just came out of undergrad and went into grad school and became a therapist, they might not have that life experience, to offer, especially because, my experiences have been relatively unique and I've been up and down and really on a roller coaster. I feel like I've lived like 4 lifetimes really already at this
Sure.
point. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the way that I connect to my clients. And yeah, I work in a pretty relatively affluent neighborhood, so we have some pretty successful people in there, and some not. There's a lot of normal people that we work with as well. And at the end of the day, everyone has the same issues. They're on a different scale. Certainly, when you're a successful person, there's more to lose in terms of your career and everything that's wrapped up in it. But we're all just human beings dealing with the same crap.
Sure.
The
Sure.
same baggage we have from our early relationships and from our romantic relationships, and we're all just trying to do the best we can. So I think that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're running a Fortune 500 company or you're a school teacher. At the end of the day, we have the same vulnerabilities we have to work through, and that's what therapy is for.
Yeah. Well, and you also mentioned before I keep going, this just spurred because even like your entire life, uh, I don't think I've ever read or met someone that, whether you knew it or not, had a how should I say this, the most well-rounded viewership of life. Like even growing up, like you had, what was it, Neil Diamond's son was on your baseball team, but then on the flip side, right, like you look across the street, it was it was not great. Like it was very dangerous. And then you're in the middle of all of this, and then you're growing up, and even in the book, like casually, it's like, oh yeah, what was it, like Jonah Hill, right? You went to his bar mitzvah, or Leonardo DiCaprio told your mom to pound sand, or something a little bit different, which it's another neither here nor there. But when you say all of these things, like it's just very casual, like, oh yeah, this happened. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, when did it hit you that your life, it's like, okay, this is not normal, because you had nothing to go off of, right?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think that growing up in LA where I did. I think I was probably a little bit less impressed in terms of celebrity and stuff like that than some going into it because I had an aunt who was a big star
Yeah.
of stage and screen. She was a Broadway star in the 60s and had a show called Knots Landing that ran from the late 70s till the early 90s. So she was a known celebrity, and so my family walked in that world a little bit, and as you said, I kind of straddled the line in LA where I grew up between the wealthiest and most prominent people in the Beverly Hillses and the Bel Airs and the Brentwoods, and then Hollywood, which was kind of a dump at the time, and the other sides of LA, going to a public elementary school where a lot of the kids were bussed in from the inner city. I think that I was very fortunate to get a glimpse of what people live like on both sides of the track, so to speak, and we were kind of like right in the middle, or maybe on the higher end of the middle. I think that where I went to school, I was like the kid from the other side of the tracks. But for a
Yeah.
lot of the city, I was probably considered a pretty privileged kid. So anyway, going into the field that we did in at the entertainment business, I had seen, and I wasn't really that impressed by your casual experience with a celebrity. But then there are some celebrities that you meet, your heroes,
Yes.
that you're just not prepared for. I mean, there's just certain people you don't expect to meet. You don't expect to walk into a room and see Prince,
Yeah. Yeah.
or Joni Mitchell, Or the one that blew me away maybe the most. We performed with Stevie Wonder. That's another one. We performed at a charity event with Stevie Wonder, and that was mind blowing because I was just like shaking a tambourine, I think, and playing some bongos. But he's on stage singing, talking, playing the harmonica, and you're hearing that voice and that harmonica sound, which is so distinctive, coming through the wedge, the monitor wedge.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's surreal because that's not something you think is ever going to happen because you've heard that sound so many times in your life on record, and then it's live coming through your sound monitor, and it's just like you want to pinch yourself. So that was really cool. The one I think that probably blew my mind the most was that we were at Clive Davis's pre-Grammys party one year, and he was the head of our record label and obviously had this storied history with signed like every known act between the 60s and currently.
Sure.
And so it was an honor to be performing there in the first place at his party, and it's a room that's filled with these kind of A-list celebrities. You can't even imagine the guest list at this place. But we're sitting at our table, kind of keeping to ourselves, just modestly waiting for, I think, our time. Maybe we had already performed. And this nice English gentleman comes over to our table, very mannerly, and I'm not going to do the accent, but he said, would it be okay if Mr. Jimmy Page says hello to you guys?
Yes.
And we're like, would it be okay? And so he walks us over to Jimmy Page's table, and he jumps up all excited, and he's like, "Hey, I love your record! Oh my God, you guys, I'm such a fan of your record. So nice to meet you." And it was just, it was backwards day because you don't expect to meet Jimmy Page, who, Led Zeppelin was one of our favorite bands of all time.
Of course.
And you think if you did ever meet somebody like that, you'd be bowing before them and just stuttering and not able to get out how much their music has meant to you, and turn it around and he's saying, "I'm a fan of yours." So that was just like, that was a moment where I was like, what is our life?
That is crazy. Well, and that's got to be weird too, because like you said, you're probably just eager to tell him like, "Oh my God," like just fangirl. I'm your biggest fan, all that. And he jumps out and it's like, no, like, I'm a fan of you. I'd literally be speechless. I'd be like, what? Like, I'm nothing compared to you, man.
I didn't believe it. I was like, there's no way that Jimmy Page listened to Maroon 5 and liked it. There's no way. But he was so genuine. And I was like, it has to be true, I guess.
That is so cool. Well, and you mentioned, switching back a little bit on the therapy side, which I found, I felt the fulfillment in your voice. And you mentioned regarding your therapist's own sobriety journey. And so you were saying that I think in 2, 3, 5 years from now, your therapist was telling you you'd barely recognize who you even are. And really looking back, you could say that about a lot of things in life, not just through like sobriety, but for you, this is a multi-parter. Knowing what you know now, what are some of the best pieces of advice you would have told your 16-year-old self when Cars Flowers was just getting going, that could potentially allow you to avoid altogether the traumatic experiences that you suffered, whether it was with anxiety, alcoholism, or depression?
Well, the one thing that you try not to have regrets, and there's that
of course
saying, like no regrets. And I think that there's two ways to look at that. I think regrets can be helpful because you learn from them, right? It's like, sure, you don't want to think of them as regrets because if they helped you become who you are today, then they had served a purpose. But at the same time, if you could do them again, you'd do them differently, right?
Right.
So with that knowledge, I think the thing that I would tell my younger self most, and I do tell young people, is to stay teachable. To be open to being out of your comfort zone and trying things that make you uncomfortable. I think for me, because I was a kid that was an overachiever and I was used to excelling at a lot of things that I applied myself to up until a certain point, and getting a lot of positive reinforcement for the things I was doing. When something presented itself as something I wasn't good at, or that wasn't immediately gratifying in that way that other things had been, my first impulse was like, I'm not interested in that anyway. That's not my thing. you know. And like the drums was just that for me in a lot of ways. It was like I got pretty good at it on my own pretty quickly, just teaching myself to play. So I figured I didn't have to take lessons. I didn't have to learn the things I never learned. And that came back to bite me in the ass, really, because there were very simple fundamental things I could have learned and practiced that would have prevented, injury later on, and that would have allowed me to play longer without fatiguing in the ways that I did. So I do think that it's the pride of the younger self, and I think a lot of young people probably have that attitude. It's like, oh, don't tell me that. I don't need to know that,
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
no, you do need to know that, and it's okay if you don't know everything yet. It's okay if you're still learning, or if you even look. Who the greatest champions of all time, the greatest artists of all time, are people who have that teachability, right? Somebody who maybe has been hitting 300 in the majors for 10 years, and they're still, learning from their batting coach, how to hit a slider even better, how to go the other way with it, how to hit this guy. I've never hit this guy before. What do I do with this? I think if you have that attitude that there's always more to learn, and that growing is part of the process, learning and growing, then you're going to be in a much better position for whatever life gives you. I think in a lot of ways I set myself up for, being stuck in some ways, not being able to work through some problems and challenges that life presented for me. That had I had that mentality, maybe I would have had a little bit more resilience.
Sure. Well, and isn't that so frustrating to look back on? Because I feel like it's one of those things where it's the whole analogy of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Like, that you should have given yourself this advice back in the day, whatever it is, but you also know that your younger self would have told you to pound sand. Like, there's no way, because until you get through it, you're not going to, it's not going to happen. So I find that absolutely fascinating. Now, I do have to ask, what for you has been more rewarding? Songs about Jane, achieving sobriety, becoming a licensed therapist, or writing your book?
Wow. Well, neither of the last two things happen if it weren't for achieving sobriety. So that obviously has to be put in a special place. I think in terms of everything altogether, if I'm looking at the whole path of my life, writing this book is probably the thing I'm most proud of, if I'm being honest. Because writing and literature was a passion of mine. When I was a little kid, I started writing. I started creative writing stories and things. And I had fantasies about writing novels when I grew up. And that was a passion that kind of got put on the back burner with everything else that was going on. And I did get an English degree at UCLA. So, that was something I fostered at that time. And then I did some writing. I was writing poetry. I was doing some other things. I mean, even with writing music, I had to kind of subvert my passions in some ways, because Adam was so gifted, Adam and Jesse together as a team, that I kind of had to find what was my place as part of the arrangement, as part of the creative team, but not the one who was writing lyrics or melodies most of the time. So I think that, expressing myself in those ways was something I wasn't doing for a long time, and probably should have been doing more of, because it was close to my heart. And then when it came time to write this book, it was the culmination of all the things that you just described. It was the ability for me to take everything I had learned in my 40 plus years on this earth, and craft it into a narrative that would be helpful for me, as sort of therapeutic for me, finding closure on all those chapters of my life, but also pass it on, pay it forward to people that needed to hear this story of hope and recovery. And so it was meaningful on so many levels for me. It was a project that was fulfilling. The process of writing and editing was really engaging. It was the first thing since being in the band that gave me that sense of flow and purpose, really just feeling like I was on a mission to do something, put something out into the world that I was creating. And then it was the altruistic element that I do in my work. It was all of that all together. So really, it was like the culmination of all that. But being a therapist, getting a master's degree, that wasn't something I saw coming.
Yeah.
So I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. Well, and I know we're coming to a close, and I could talk your ear off all day long. I truly feel like we've become best friends. Now, you mentioned earlier that you've got a ton coming down the pike. That is Ryan Dusick. So what are future plans looking like for you? Do you have any fun projects coming out that you'd like to share with our listeners? Give us a little taste into what's going on with Ryan.
Yeah, so as I've started to promote my book, I have found all these new opportunities arising to speak, to do appearances and to be of service in the ways that I have been for a few years now, but now hopefully on a slightly larger platform. And so I'm doing these engagements. I'm speaking on a panel at South by Southwest about mental health in the touring industry. We're doing another one like that later in the year at another symposium for performing arts medicine. And I'm doing, mental health. A lot of different organizations are reaching out to me to be an advocate, really. So that's really stuff that I'm looking forward to. And hopefully that will lead to more writing as well. I do intend to do more writing, whether it be another books. I wrote an article for Variety magazine, which that was another dream come true, because journalism was something that I had thought about as another path if music hadn't worked out. And so, I don't know, I see myself doing all of the above on top of the fact that I'm building a practice as a therapist. My website, ryandusick.com, you can find all of this stuff. So it's a little bit of all of those things put together. I'd be lying if I said in the same way that I know exactly what my life will look like 5 years from now as I did 5 years ago, because it's changing and evolving as I go. The best advice I have for myself at this point is just do the next indicated action. That's what I've been doing for the last 7 years of sobriety, and it's led me to this point of fulfillment and purpose. So I'm just going to keep doing that. It's like right now on my plate, there's some really interesting, fascinating things to take on. And whatever life presents me, if it feels purposeful, if it feels meaningful, just walking forward into that next thing usually will lead you to something even better. Not always, but I think that's the mindset, the next indicated action that leads to a life of fulfillment.
Yeah, and actually that is why you decided to come on full circle, Capitalize Your Finances podcast. I mean, let's just keep it real. Now, before we close it out, where can capitalizers go to find you and support you the most? Is it Instagram, your website? Where can they find you?
Yeah, I try to keep my website, ryandusick.com, up to date with all of my appearances and other stuff. And if you're looking, in terms of my work as a therapist or as a coach, life coach, you can find me through my website. I do stay really active on Instagram at Ryan Michael Dusick. That's kind of the spot where I post everything, sometimes like clips of me talking, to people like you or doing my in-person stuff, but also just old footage of me and the band, videos and photos of my other life. It's kind of it's a fun intersection between my old world and my new world and how they're kind of colliding now. So definitely at Ryan Michael Dusick on Instagram, and I'm on the other apps as well, but that's kind of the main one.
Sure. Well, and I'll tell you, when our studio is up and running, we're going to have you up for an in-person interview, and then we can actually meet in person, because this has been absolutely fantastic. So Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the show. And for those of you still listening in, thank you for tuning in to Capitalize Your Finances. If you have any questions about today's episode, feel free to shoot me an email, chris@capitalizeyourfinances.com, or you can give me a call at 253-214-3050. That's 253-214-3050. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions that are on your minds. If you have any questions about future guests or topics that you'd like yours truly to talk about, shoot me an email, go to capitalizepodcast.com, and I'd be more than happy to check the email and get back to you as soon as possible. As always, I'm your host, Chris Ray Panayiotou, the Cap and Capitalize, and until next time, keep capitalizing.
Christopher Panayiotou is a registered representative with and securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and member FINRA SIPC. The investment professionals are affiliated with LPL Financial and are conducting business using the name Capitalize Your Finances, a separate entity from LPL Financial. Ryan Dusick is not affiliated with Capitalize Your Finances or LPL Financial.